Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the home theater geek. Welcome to AVS Forum Tech Talk. I am joined, as always, by our technical director, Chris Mata, who is behind the scenes most of the time, but I love to say hi. Hey, Chris, how you doing?
Hey, how's it going? Glad to be here.
Good to have you with us. Thanks so much for running all the controls and pushing all the buttons behind the scenes.
Yeah, I'm the wizard behind
That's right.
the
Pay no
curtain,
attention to
as it
that
would
man
be.
behind the curtain. Well, thanks again for being here. And let me introduce our guest for this episode. He is the general manager of Trinnov Audio and my first returning guest, Chuck Back. Chuck, welcome back, so to
Thanks, Scott.
speak.
Glad to be back,
Yeah,
as always.
I'm sure you're glad to be back. Yes, as is your whole family, I'm
Yeah.
sure. Um, we are live right now, so if you have a question for Chuck, you can post it in the comments, and I'll be looking at those as we go and pass along some of the more relevant comments and questions. So, Chuck, when you were here last June, we were talking about immersive audio, and we had also intended to talk about something else, but of course, we ran out of time. So, thanks a lot for coming back to talk about the second topic we wanted to address, which is room correction. So, give us a basic definition, a place to start when we want to think about room correction.
We think about room correction because of what happens when we put speakers in rooms. If you put a speaker in a room, any room, the sound is going to change depending on many characteristics of that room. The location of the speaker is relevant, the location of the listener, the type of furnishings in the room, whether there are hard surfaces or a lot of soft surfaces like furniture. Is there a lot of glass? And then the room dimensions themselves are a fundamental issue in terms of low frequencies. So we take this speaker that was I designed for an ideal environment, put it in a room, and things change.
Mm-hmm.
And they change to an even greater extent if we have more than one speaker in the room,
Which most of us do.
and particularly if we get into Atmos level systems. So
Right.
this is the reason that we have room correction, in order to fix the things that we can to get to an ideal situation, as ideal as possible for that room.
But am I correct that there's only so much you can do with electronics? And what you really want to start with is the room itself?
It is very true. There is a fundamental aspect that we're dealing with here. It's called physics.
You cannot
And
change the laws of physics.
yes, there are no miracles there. So when we talk about fixing what is a less than ideal situation in a room, we can do many things electronically, and with today's tools that are pretty powerful, there's a lot we can do, but there's a lot we can't do, and so we do need to look to the room, and that is really where we need to start to talk about room correction.
Right. Now I notice in your room, you're sitting in your demo room home theater there, and you've got a lot of acoustic panels on your walls.
Yes. If we bring up the first slide, we can see a ray trace pattern of this particular room
Right.
that shows. This is for mid-range and higher frequencies, but it shows.
This is the room you're sitting in right now?
Yes, yes. And it's showing the speaker locations, and it's showing for your main speakers where the sound bounces. And so the idea that we're hearing sound directly from speakers is not terribly accurate. The reality is, when we're in a room with speakers, we're hearing more sound reflecting off the walls of the room than we're hearing directly from the speakers. So this gives us an indication of what happens at mid-range and higher frequencies. And then at lower frequencies, the response is determined by the room dimensions, in addition to the speaker placement, the subwoofers in particular, and the placement of the listeners. So all of those are factors that enter into what the ultimate response is going to be.
Right. Got a question here in the chat room. In the back of your theater there, you see these foam pads that have squares of staggered depth.
Correct. Those are diffusers.
Uh-huh.
So that's those are actually made of styrofoam, not soft foam.
Hmm.
And the purpose of a diffuser is to not absorb sound, but spread the sound. So
Mhm.
when sound strikes a diffuser, because of the irregular surfaces and the irregular depths, the sound is scattered. So you avoid the possibility of hearing a direct reflection off a side wall from a speaker.
Mm.
In general, we use the diffusion in the back of the room and on the ceiling rather than in the front of the room. In the front of the room, we tend to want to absorb sound. In the back of the room, we want to diffuse it and make the perception of the surround channels a bit more immersive and less directional.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The second part of the question is, how does that improve the noise insulation over flat foam? And you're not really, the purpose of those panels is not for noise insulation, but as you say, for diffusion.
Correct. There's no, it's not reducing any noise. It's not reducing any transmission either into the room or out of the room.
Mm-hmm.
It's simply to deal with the sound as it's reflected in the room.
Right, right. We're not quite ready for that graphic.
Yeah, we can come back to that in a bit.
Chris, thanks.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned to me the issue that you have to think about the type of speaker that's in the room.
Correct.
And that different types of speakers have different characteristics that you need to think about. So
yeah,
tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's part of the design aspect when one's designing a room, a theater room, for example. Where we put the treatments and the type of treatments that we use will vary depending on the type of speaker that we're using. If we're using a conventional hi-fi type speaker that uses a dome tweeter, we tend to want to absorb any sound that would be reflecting from the sidewalls or the floor or ceiling.
Is that because a dome tweeter has a very wide dispersion pattern?
Well, it's because it does have wide dispersion, but the off-axis response, which is the element that is going to be reflecting from the room surfaces,
Mm-hmm.
is not well correlated with the direct response that comes to our ears, the on-axis response.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is going to tend to blur the sound, and it's not desirable to have. We want to tend to absorb that.
Mm-hmm.
If we have a speaker that has more of a controlled dispersion pattern, something that's using a waveguide, for example, which
Mm-hmm.
is typical for many of the higher performance theater speakers, their off-axis response is more uniform. And in those cases, we don't necessarily want to destroy that energy. That can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll use a different type of treatment that would combine both elements of diffusion and absorption.
So it wouldn't absorb everything or as much as possible, but some.
Correct.
And then diffuse what's left. So.
Yes, there are custom panels that will do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we tend to design into rooms that have those types of speakers.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to mention that the speakers behind you are of this type we're talking about. They have waveguide tweeters, and they're from a company you're also involved in.
Yes, those are Priscilla P6Vs.
Okay.
And you can see the waveguide for the tweeter, which is a device that actually shapes the response so that there is a wider radiation pattern at higher frequencies. You don't tend to get the beaming effect that you get with a dome tweeter, where
Mm-hmm.
the response is concentrated on directly on axis.
I'm getting a note in the chat room that I'm quiet compared to you. So let me see if I can increase my volume a little bit here. Thank you to Beatmaster. I'll see if that helps. Um, okay, so another type of speaker that some people are using is called a line array.
Right.
Now, how does that compare with what we're talking about?
Well, those speakers tend to be more focused on the vertical axis, so they don't have the effects of reflecting from floor and ceiling.
Hmm.
And there are other differentiators. They tend to have less of a drop off in volume level as you get more distant from the loudspeaker.
Mm-hmm.
So with a line array, you can do different things. And again, it's the point being that you want to take into account what devices you're going to be using in the room before you put your plan together in terms of acoustical treatments.
Mm-hmm. And another aspect of this, I've heard and seen the effect of speaker placement and listener placement or seat placement.
And that is a very significant factor, and it particularly comes into effect with low frequencies.
Right.
And we have basically what we consider small rooms for theaters. A large room would be something the size of a commercial cinema. In a commercial cinema, we can put subwoofers pretty much where we want to. They're generally up against the front wall, and the response is going to be pretty uniform over the entire auditorium. In a smaller room, which is 20 by 30 or even a little more than that, is those are all considered small rooms from the standpoint of low frequencies. If you look at the wavelength of a 20 hertz note, that's 17 meters. So
or about 55 feet, as I recall.
Yeah, exactly. So that's in any kind of typical home theater environment, we are going to have standing waves that reinforce certain frequencies and cancel other frequencies.
Right, at certain points within the room.
And that's exactly right. You will have a situation. Let's say we put a single subwoofer in a room, and this room has, let's say, 6 seats. We will measure and hear a different response in each of those seats. So this is one of the major challenges of getting consistent performance in a multi-seat environment.
Right, exactly. Now, I've also heard it said that one subwoofer in a small room is going to inevitably lead to problems, and 2 or more will help the situation.
That's our first step to solving the challenge. If you have one person listening in one seat and one subwoofer, that can be made to work well. And very often that's the situation in a stereo playback system.
Exactly. The audiophile is often sitting by him or herself in the room, in the sweet spot, listening.
Right.
But in a home theater, not so much.
We've got to deal with multiple listeners now, and that's where having additional subwoofers helps. A second subwoofer is strongly beneficial because now we are driving the low frequencies of the room from 2 locations. We can even go beyond that. In the ideal situation, I'll recommend 4 subwoofers, which is probably the sweet spot in terms of return on investment. In many cases, it's a cost no object theater because that can be very expensive. But the point is that by having multiple locations in the room, we're going to smooth out the response and make it easier to get that consistent seat to seat low frequency performance.
But of course, many people can't afford 4 subwoofers.
No.
I mean, you could get less expensive ones, I suppose, but then you run into other problems.
Yeah.
But in any event, now that we've talked about the acoustics of the room and where to place things and acoustic panels such as you have in your room and so on, you could even go farther by using room correction.
Exactly.
So tell us now. Let's get a little deeper into room correction. What exactly is that? I mean, I'm correct, right, that most AV receivers have some sort of automatic room correction built in,
Right.
and
So
higher priced things, processors such as the Trinnov, which is the company you work for, have yet more sophisticated automatic room correction. So let's talk about what exactly is room correction, the history of it. Maybe
yeah,
can we get into that a little bit?
yeah. We've if we go back many years prior to the existence of DSP capabilities, uh, room correction was being done using basic microphone setup and generally using pink noise and what we called real-time analyzers. In a crude sense, a real-time analyzer might only measure octave to octave response, which is not going to correct very effectively. Usually these were third octave analyzers.
Right.
So basically the ability to adjust 30 points on the audio spectrum. But these were, the correction was done in the analog domain and was not terribly sophisticated. The analog filters introduced phase issues and other problems. So they were not really effective in the sense that we could achieve today. But it was being used in sound reinforcement, being used in commercial cinema, but not very much in terms of audiophile systems.
Right. Because I assume from what you're saying, it might have done more harm than good.
In many cases, yes. That's why there were some products that were aimed to the audiophile market, and I can't say that they were terribly successful. So let's leave it at that.
All right, fine. But then we entered the digital realm.
Yes. So now we have the ability to do much more sophisticated things. You know, all of the systems start with a microphone. We've got to take a measurement. So we are either going to set up a microphone in a single position to measure the response at that point in the room. With other systems, some of the more sophisticated ones, we will take multiple measurements
at different locations.
Yes, we'll move the microphone from, for example, we could take a measurement in each seat in a theater. And if you see what the more sophisticated calibrators who do this on an ongoing basis for a living, they'll in many cases will have multiple microphones, and we'll set up a half dozen microphones in the room to take measurements.
Like one in each seat, for example.
Exactly. Yes. So they can see what's happening in each seat at the same time. But going back to just the basic concept, we're going to take a measurement, whether we take one or more. That measurement is going to provide us with information that is to the level of sophistication of the correction system. It may measure simply the frequency response of the system,
which is to say the relative amplitude at different frequencies.
Exactly. So we see where there are peaks, maybe in the low frequencies or nulls, and where there might be other problems through the range. More sophisticated systems will measure additional things like impulse response and phase, which we'll talk about more later on. But once the system has taken its measurements, it will then generate a set of filters to correct what it's capable of doing. And that will obviously depends on whether you're talking about one of the more sophisticated systems or a basic system that's just going to try to equalize the frequency response. And those systems will vary in terms of the correction that gets applied, depending on how well developed the system is. There's a pretty wide range of capabilities.
Sure.
If you look at what's available with the receiver up to the most sophisticated separate components.
I think can we look at the amplitude
Yeah,
graph? Is that the
yeah,
next thing to look at?
yeah. So this is from a Trinnov processor. The top curve shows the frequency response as measured for 3 loudspeakers, the left, center, and right speakers in this system.
Mm-hmm.
So we can see that they at the low frequencies, they don't really reproduce very much. There's a fair amount of variation through most of the range, and then they roll off at the high frequencies.
For sure.
The bottom graph shows us the corrected response after the Trinnov processor has applied the correction filter.
Man, which looks
So-
like flat as a pancake.
Yeah, so that is that's the power of a well-designed, sophisticated system.
Mm-hmm.
So you just have some very minor variations in basically response within plus or minus 1 or 2 decibels,
Mm-hmm.
which is ideal, and that's the response that will be at that position.
Right. I should say that we're using the Trinnov processor for these visual examples because that's what you have access to, and it's a sophisticated system that
Yeah.
people really like. But it demonstrates or illustrates the concepts that we're talking about.
Yeah, this the intent here is to show what the capabilities of systems, not really compare any particular systems.
Right.
And the Trinnov will show what can be done with a really high level of performance.
Mm-hmm.
One of the aspects that gets into personal choice then would be what we see on the next slide, which is the ability in some cases, depending on the sophistication of the system, to do a personal tuning of the system. And that's what we call a target curve.
Mm-hmm.
If you recall from the last slide, the response was a flat line.
Right.
Basically, no boost or cut anywhere. This is generally not at all desirable in a home listening environment.
The flat curve.
The
that we
flat
saw
response,
before.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Why is
The-
that?
A flat response is going to sound in a room very bright, and it's going to sound bass shy.
Mm.
It's because of a couple of characteristics. One is the way the microphone captures versus how we hear, and just general human perception and what we like to hear.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to put a target curve in gives the user a way to tune the system, either for a personal preference or potentially to match the response of a given speaker system that they chose to purchase.
Mm-hmm.
And when the target curve is applied, the room correction system applies that as part of the filter. So instead of trying to achieve a flat line response, as we saw in the other graph, we're trying to achieve the response. If we can go back to the slide, this replicates what's called the B&K curve. This comes research from B&K, the microphone company, did many years ago, and it is representative of what most target curves look like. A boost in the bass that is in the 2 to 4 decibel range. As you can see, it's boosted up to about 100 hertz, and then gradually starts rolling off with a taper, so that it's down maybe 2 or 3 decibels at the highest frequencies.
This resembles, I think Harman research came up with a very similar target curve.
Yeah, it's very similar to that, and calibrators will have their own curves that they apply, and in the higher performing room correction systems, this is something that the user has control over.
Right. In some cases, there might be a preset one that you can't change, but in other cases, you could create one whatever you want.
Exactly.
Okay. Michael Batterin in the chat room, whose home theater was recently featured on AVS Forum as Home Theater of the Month, says, interesting, I never thought about using multiple microphones. Now, that would require a soft piece of software in your computer that can deal with multiple microphones and an interface that can deal with multiple microphones. That can't be cheap.
No, it isn't. You're gonna have to purchase the multiple microphones and some sort of matrix box to feed the outputs to the computer.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's really, I mean, if you're seriously into it, I suppose you could invest the money, but it's generally the calibrators who do this for a living.
It's the pros.
Yeah, that have that.
Right, exactly. Now the target curve, I guess, again, getting back to are you measuring for one seat or are you measuring for multiple seats? You'd ideally want the target curve to reach the target curve at all the seats in the room.
Well, that raises an interesting point, for which there isn't a single answer. There are multiple approaches. Some systems will recommend that multiple measurements be taken throughout the room before any correction is applied. So the target curve in that case will get applied, but it will get applied to the net result of all of the measurements. In my experience working with the Trinnov processor, I've tended to work towards fewer measurements and concentrating on making the measurements in the main listening area. And I found that gives a more consistent result and a better result in the primary listening seats.
But what about the other seats? I mean, you're going to have guests over. You don't want them to have crap sound, right?
Well, the good news is it doesn't really result in significantly poorer sound for those other seats.
Okay.
Now this may vary from system to system. So in this case, I'm wearing my Trinnov cap and just addressing that. And I'm not suggesting that other systems that ask the calibrator to take additional measurements are wrong in any way. But for our system, I've found that focusing on a narrower center in the prime listening area tends to give a better result, rather than trying to apply measurements taken in the extreme seats to the farthest to give more benefit to compromise for those seats, essentially.
The seats at the end of the rows nearest the walls, where you're going to have more problems anyway.
Exactly. And so your mileage may vary on this, but that's that's my take on it.
Okay.
And in a system, in the better systems, including Trinnov and others, there is the ability to store multiple presets. So one can create a correction for a single seat, for a primary seat, and then a correction that is more general to apply to the entire seating area.
Right. Let's see. Daryl Austin is asking, why not connect the mic to a PC instead of the Trinnov, especially when the pre-pro is in another room? Well, it doesn't matter where the pre-pro is. It's where the microphone is that counts, right?
Yeah. Well, it's exactly. And in the case of the Trinnov, this is unique, but the PC is in the Trinnov.
It's true. It's a PC.
Yeah. So all of the measurements, everything is stored on board the processor. So there's no there's no storage of anything on a separate PC or a tablet. Those are used strictly for accessing the computer that's on board.
So it's a user interface.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a VNC connection. So you're really controlling the computer that's on board.
Beatmaster asks, do sweet spots still exist? If I mean, in the sense of this is going to be the primary listening location. If the question is about sweet spots in the conventional stereo sense, I suppose that would be again the prime listening position for the left and right speakers. But we're in a world where there are multiple speakers in the room, so we can create a prime position, and I suppose we can have a sweet spot
for the main speakers, but we're not going to be able to have a conventional sweet spot for surrounds, rear speakers, top speakers that are the high channels. We're dealing with a lot of different speakers in different locations. So that's one of the primary things that that a sophisticated room correction system addresses. The fact that we don't have sweet spots for all the speakers.
Now, you mentioned earlier that sophisticated systems will go beyond frequency response and the relative amplitude of different frequencies within the audible range. Tell us about some of those other measurements that will help improve the final result.
Right. So if we look at a basic system that's just measuring frequency response, that system is just looking at amplitude. The more sophisticated systems are going to take time into account. So we want to see what is happening over time with the response in the room. And to do so, we're looking at the impulse response of the system. We're also looking at phase. A system that measures for those will apply a different type of signal as its test signal. It can be a form of a frequency sweep that starts at low frequencies and goes to high, or it can be just a constant noise tone. Sort of sounds like a little bit like pink noise. That is an MLS tone, maximum length sequence. What these measurements are doing is capturing the impulse response of all the speakers in the room.
Now, I've always thought impulse meant just a sudden, quick pop.
It is. That's correct. If we wanted to, the ideal way to measure impulse response would be to have a super sharp transient like a gunshot.
Right.
If we actually can take an impulse response of an environment, we can measure the impulse response of a concert hall by doing something like firing a blank gun in the room and capturing,
and measuring what happens. Yeah.
Yeah. Now we can't do that with a speaker because we'll destroy it. So,
well, couldn't you play a recording of a gunshot?
It's not going to be sufficient. It's got to be of a sufficient level to essentially destroy the speaker. So, so what we do is we do these captures, and then they give us the equivalent of a single impulse, and then we can. Once we have that information, we can use what's called a fast Fourier transform, and we can derive all of the other measurement information. We can get the frequency response, we can get the phase.
Oh, really?
And so that's how the more sophisticated systems work. They're taking that impulse response information and then deriving the information, but they're able to see what is happening over time. And
we have a couple of graphics, I think. Is this a time to show them?
Yeah. So this is a measurement of. Let's go back one. So this is the impulse response measurement of the LCR speakers that we looked at earlier. Top graph shows the before, and the bottom graph shows the after. Now, what we should be seeing ideally is just a single line that is overlaid on the 3 millisecond point. We don't see that in the top graph. We see the movement going forward, and then it moves radically backwards, and then kind of jumps around in the speakers. So we don't have a particularly good impulse response. With the correction, though, we see that all the speakers are now lined up, and together we see a single spike.
Yeah, and not a strong deviation in both directions, but only in one direction.
which is what we were looking for.
Okay.
So this is what happens when we correct for the impulse response.
Mm-hmm.
And this again, this is not something you're going to find in the typical receiver-based system, but
Right.
you're going to see this in the better systems.
Right. Right.
Uh,
What is the result? What is the audible result when listening to music or a soundtrack when you make this kind of correction?
Well, this kind of gets to a fundamental point I'd like to talk about
Sure.
a little bit in terms of what happens when we have lots of speakers in a room.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say we're in this system is I think 20 some speakers in this system.
That you're in the room you're in.
Yeah, it's 23 here. And I think this measurement is showing most of them, if not all. But when the founders of Trinnov were starting to do their research into spatial audio, they were doing experiments with lots of loudspeakers, and this dates back to over 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And very early, they discovered that they could capture sound and play it back over multiple speakers. But it was one thing to have sound coming from a lot of places in a room, but a very different thing to try to get a coherent sound field.
What do you mean by coherent sound field?
When we hear sound in the world, we don't hear sound coming from discrete sources like loudspeakers. It's just a natural sound field.
Mm.
When we're playing back speakers in a conventional playback system, there's a tendency for us to locate the speakers because we hear the sound coming from the speaker.
We're very good at directionality.
And a lot of that is because we have speakers in different locations in the room.
Mm-hmm.
They're pointed in different directions. Some are on the ceiling, some are in front of us, some are behind us. And typically, we have different types of speakers. The speaker that you have for your LCRs is probably a large, higher output, more bass capable speaker
Mm-hmm.
than the surround speakers. And they're probably more capable of bass than the speakers on the ceiling for your high channels.
Right.
So each of those speakers is not only in a different location, but it has a different characteristic. So the phase of those speakers is going to be different. The response is going to be different. And we're very good at identifying those differences. We're
As
not,
human beings, you mean?
Yes, as listeners, as human beings and listeners, we're not convinced. We're not going to be convinced. We know that there is artificial sound taking place.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to the development of the Trinnov processor and the optimizer, they determined that a fundamental aspect of reproducing spatial sound with accuracy was having all of the speakers work together, having all of them aligned in time, so that in essence, all frequencies from all speakers are arriving our ears at the same time. And that's how we hear sound in the real world. So we get when we have systems at this level of sophistication, we get a seamless bubble of sound. And it's much more natural, and we lose the sense of listening to individual sources of sound.
Mm-hmm. Does that mean that because the different speakers in the room are different distances away, that you're actually delaying the sound from certain speakers more than others, so that the sound arrives from all of them arrive at your ears at the same time?
In a basic sense, absolutely. And any surround receiver does have that capability. Mm-hmm. The amount of granularity is going to vary from one system to another.
Sure.
Some will allow you to do just a millisecond difference in terms of delays, physical delays. Mm-hmm. But the idea there is we either measure with the microphone or we measure with a tape measure the distance from the listening position to the speakers, and we put a delay on the speakers that are closer to us, so that the speaker that is furthest away determines the actual arrival time of all the other speakers.
Right. But the difference in distance between speakers in a small room, which is what we're talking about, really isn't very much. So the delay time would have to be very short.
Well, the greater the resolution we have on that delay, the better the reproduction is going to be. So that's where a system that can accurately measure the distances is going to do a much better job than having to get out a tape measure and measure. And then beyond that, we're now talking about getting the arrival of all frequencies. So it's not just the overall sound coming from the 20 some speakers in the room, but we want to have what is coming from each speaker in phase, so that we're hearing low frequencies and high frequencies arriving at the same time. And that's what we can achieve with a high performance time-based system.
Right. And we have the next slide shows us actually the impulse response for all the speakers in your room.
Yeah.
Which we want to take a quick look at and see the before and after.
So you can see there, we've got all the speakers overlaid on the top. So some of them are going one way, some are going the other way, and it's just kind of a mishmash there. And the bottom graph, you can see they're all aligned. And what that means is, in this case, with the correction being applied, all of the speakers are working together. And that's what creates that bubble of sound. A
cohesive sound field that more accurately mimics how we hear in the real world.
Exactly. Yep.
Right. Norway Man 1981 is asking a question that we actually addressed a little earlier, so I'm just going to bring it up now to tell you that if you tuned in late, go back and listen to the first part of the podcast, which is, what are your thoughts of addressing acoustic challenges passively versus through filters through a processor? Is there a resource or literature you could recommend? That's a good question. We did talk about passive acoustic treatments in the room, which is kind of what you want to do first, and then apply digital signal processing, what we're talking about now in room correction, to get the rest of the way. Is there any resource you can recommend for people to read about this?
Don't have something that comes to mind right away. Maybe we can post something afterwards.
Yeah. We'll do some research and post something with the video afterwards. But it's a good question. Here's a good question from Beatmaster. Dolby Atmos speaker that reflect off the ceiling confuse me. Do I measure the distance directly from the driver to the listening position, or include the distance to the ceiling?
That's a very good question.
I thought so too.
Which is my way of saying I'm going to have to think about it.
Yeah.
It seems to me, I don't have a specific answer because I haven't seen the Dolby recommendation on it. It seems to me it's the ceiling reflection would be the appropriate one.
I would think so too.
Yeah, because that's where we're going to image the
right. That's where the sound is apparently coming from. Josmo65 is saying, "Hi Chuck, I'm still rocking my Sherwood Newcastle R972 that had Trinnov processing built in. Any chance we might see something like that in a newer receiver one day? Are you guys going to license Trinnov processing out to other manufacturers? You know?
I can't say.
Okay.
There's certainly no current plan to do that.
Right.
I won't say no that it's not possible at some point in the future. But all of our engineering efforts and research efforts are towards advancing what we're doing on the Trinnov.
On your product. Yeah. I get it.
That's I'm Jasmo, that's great that your Sherwood is still running.
Yeah, really.
I've had two of them. That was actually my first contact with Trinnov. Is I was one of the first people to actually have one of those.
Oh yeah,
because I was doing some work for them, some technical and PR writing for them, and was blown away with it. And I've been a Trinnov fanatic ever since. But unfortunately, the HDMI failed on both of those receivers over time.
It happens.
Yeah, it was a classic receiver, but it wasn't the most reliable product. I'm afraid.
Right. Well, we've talked about impulse, and I also want to, we have a couple graphics about phase too, and you were starting to talk about phase.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure we cover that sufficiently.
Yeah. So The better systems are going to correct for phase as well, which is going to give us that coincident arrival of all frequencies.
Mhm.
We're going to see with multiple speakers in the room, with multiple designs, we're going to see different phase response from each speaker. Even a good speaker is going to be less than optimal when it's installed in a multi-channel environment.
Mhm.
So
Now, are you talking about the different drivers within that speaker?
it is very often the crossover point where we see phase issues,
Okay.
because we've got to transition from a woofer to a tweeter, for example,
Mhm.
and at that point the filters that are being applied to roll off the woofer at higher frequencies and the tweeter at lower frequencies will introduce phase rotations where the phase goes through 360 degrees over a given frequency.
Mhm.
And if that can be corrected, we improve that coherence of sound.
Mhm.
Things are more natural, voices are clearer, there's more intelligibility of dialogue,
Mhm.
and it is a fundamental way of getting all the speakers in a multi-channel system to work in unison.
And we have a couple graphics there to
Yeah.
show the phase measurements. This is, I think, with LCR again. No, let's go to.
Yeah, this is just left and right speakers.
Oh, just left and right. Okay.
So we can see that there's a couple of phase rotations at low frequencies. There's a couple at 200 hertz, and then the ones at higher frequencies are around the crossover point.
Mm-hmm.
This system is set up to correct for phase above about 150 cycles, so the lower frequencies aren't being addressed, but you can see with the center graph that the phase is much tighter aligned within a few degrees across pretty much everything above about 150 cycles.
So the top graph is unprocessed.
Correct.
The middle graph is processed.
Yes, that's post-processing.
Post-processing, okay, and the phase below 150, as you say, is not really addressed. What about the bottom graph?
Bottom is the correction. That's actually, we're showing the filter there.
Oh, I see. Okay,
so you can see how the correction was being applied.
Right. And then we also have a picture, I believe, of all 23 speakers in your room.
Yeah, so this shows kind of a mess and how much we fix things. So this is the example. The top in particular shows you how all the speakers, and they're very similar speakers, are not behaving the same.
Right, even though they're from the same company and they're of similar design.
Exactly. Yeah, they're all using the same tweeter, but there's a different characteristic for each one based on where they are. In the room.
Wow, wow, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We do this with I mentioned a couple of the approach that we use to address this is a couple of different types of filters, which I wanted to mention.
Please.
A system that is correcting for amplitude response, so we're just correcting for frequency, can use what we call an IIR filter, infinite impulse response. An IIR filter is similar to an analog filter in some ways. It basically, with these filters, we can specify a frequency, center frequency, a width of the filter, to what frequency above and to what frequency below we're correcting, and the amount of correction, boost or cut.
Mm-hmm. Much like an equalizer.
Yeah, it's very like similar.
A band pass equalizer.
Yes. So that's what is typically used in systems that are not doing the time-based corrections.
Right, which are impulse and phase.
Yeah. Yes. And
so what type of filters then do get added or are used instead of?
So we're using an FIR filter there, which is a finite impulse response. It's a much more sophisticated filter. It can be used for a narrower set of frequencies, very narrow. And the benefit of using an FIR filter is it does adjust independently for amplitude and phase. So this is where we can get the correction that you saw on the graph that we just showed.
Mm-hmm.
So the trade-off with an FIR is that it requires quite a bit of calculation ability.
Processing power.
Yeah, it's got to have the processing power to handle
Mm-hmm.
multiple frequencies. And generally, the FIR filters are generally used at higher frequencies. If you noticed at the graph before, we weren't correcting below 150, and that's because in the Trinnov processor, we just correct with an FIR filter roughly below 150, although that's adjustable.
Below or above?
Below,
150?
but above 150. I'm sorry,
Above
above 150 for FIR. So the IR filter does not correct for phase, and therefore those are not addressed.
Do you address them in some other way?
No, it's addressed through the filter itself, through the
I mean,
IR
below
filter.
150 hertz. I mean,
No, at that point it becomes really difficult to try to do the correction because it's more difficult to do at lower frequencies. It requires more computation. It also adds latency to the system. So it's really a practical application.
Mm-hmm. It could be done, but point of diminishing returns, maybe.
Yeah. There's some significant trade-offs there.
Yeah. Okay. So Trinnov is one company that certainly does this more sophisticated time-based correction. Dirac is another. We should just mention.
Yeah, Dirac is definitely one of the top calibration systems that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
There are others. There's Room Perfect is another system. We also have Odyssey, which is very popular.
Mm-hmm. Do they do some of this impulse time correction?
I'm not sure if they. I don't believe they do, but I'm not completely familiar with
you don't
the other
represent
systems.
them. We can't really say anything.
Yeah,
about
I don't want
them,
to. I don't want to. Yeah, they're well-regarded system.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and it's used in a lot, and then a lot of AVRs. Then there are the proprietary, the ones that are developed and used by individual companies. Like Yamaha has one, Sony has one, Pioneer has one.
The Anthem system.
System has one that's very well regarded.
Yeah.
So, in a way, doing some research on these different systems in different processors might help one narrow their choice, of which one to buy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, not everybody can afford a Trinnov. That you guys have among the most expensive processors on the market, and arguably the best. I mean, I'm not trying to advertorialize here, but the CEDIA demos that use Trinnov, the super high-end home theaters that use Trinnov. You're also in professional applications. I mean, there's a reason for that. So I just want to make that point.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to remain as objective as possible.
I appreciate that.
I'm wearing my Trinnov shirt, but
yeah, that's right. You're wearing your Trinnov shirt. Okay, and that's where you work, and that's what you know.
Yeah.
Now, I want to point out here before we run out of time the microphone that you guys use, that the Trinnov uses, which is, I think, very cool. We have a picture of it, and I want you to tell us why it's designed the way it is. Let's take a look at that photo if we can. There it is.
So this is the Trinnov calibration mic. It's unique to Trinnov. It's our mic. We invented it, developed it. You can see that it's not a single microphone element. There are 4 elements there. And with that, we're actually capturing information that we can use to map a speaker system in 3-dimensional space. We're measuring the azimuth and the elevation of each loudspeaker. Mm-hmm. And so we know where the speakers are in the room with great accuracy, within 1 or 2 centimeters and 1 or 2 degrees of azimuth and elevation. So it is really quite sophisticated compared to other microphones that are just capturing basic information.
Right. A single microphone element can't really capture direction.
Exactly. Yeah, there need to be multiple elements in order to capture the different arrival times from each loudspeaker.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's a very sophisticated system, as we have said, and I hope people who are listening and watching the show will get to experience it somewhere. I do have one more question here from the chat room. Goes back to the issue of how many subs to put in a room. He says, Horizon Brave it is. He says, when I think about 4 subs, I think about just 4 times the amount of deep bass. How do you walk the line between adding it for what you're talking about, that is smoothing out the bass response in the room, and just becoming louder?
It's really not about becoming louder in this case.
No.
And in some cases, adding subwoofers does not give you the expected increase in output. If the subwoofers are placed to achieve the best response, you may not get that additional output that you might intuitively assume you would be getting. But ultimately, regardless of the number of subwoofers, you're going to be calibrating the system so that the bass level is consistent with the response of the rest of the system.
Mm-hmm.
It may be exactly flat with the rest of the spectrum. More than likely, you're going to boost the subs because most people do.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, you're going to adjust the level so that you're getting essentially the same output with 4 subs that you would get with a single sub. I mean, at some point, the single sub will run out of volume. But if you're talking about a normal playback level, you're going to be adjusting the subs in calibration so you have the proper level.
Right.
So
Right.
it's not about more output,
Right.
and you won't get more output. It's not going to be too much bass. You're going to have better sounding bass because each sub's not going to have to work as hard.
Mm-hmm.
So there should
Exactly.
be more
It has
definition.
more headroom, which I always advocate. You don't want to push any component to its limit.
Yeah.
You want to have some headroom to its performance so that it's operating in a comfortable range.
Yeah, and with today's soundtracks getting more and more deep bass content, which is great for people with multiple subwoofers, single subs and smaller subs are going to be overtaxed. They're going to be asked to do more than they're actually capable of doing.
Right. Well, let's see. Let's bring Chris back if he's around. See if he has any comments or questions. Chris, are you around?
Coming back in. Don't worry.
Coming back in. Here he comes.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, yeah. So I had to save the battery on the camera. Apparently, it overheats.
I have that.
So you've been listening, Chris. You're building a home theater now, right?
I am building a home theater. Long road to hoe for sure. This one has. We originally started thinking about this after I sold the last house. We pretty much had a 6-month hiatus to where we had no audio, like it was TV and nothing else. So we moved houses and ripping apart the Batcave, which was a very popular series on my YouTube channel. The building the theater, living with it for a little bit, and then having nothing for a while kind of made me antsy. Like I wanted to get something built. So we contacted our buddies over at Ascendo, kind of got a system going in which we thought that this new house we're going to be at, probably not going to be forever house. Let's plan for the big ranch that we want to have, 5 years down the road. Bought up all kinds of speakers, right? All kinds of big speakers. And then they got delivered and sat here in the garage. And now we're finally,
no fun.
Yeah, now we're finally getting everything to happen. And it's every single time I start talking, all these robots come in with their
God,
adult situations.
Yeah,
that's incredible.
I think it's a physical attack on me.
It's following you.
Be. Oh my God! Wow, that's amazing. So I assume that after listening to what we've been talking about, you're going to be doing some acoustic treatments and room correction in your new room.
Yes. So along with the system that's being planned and with the construction that's going on right now, there are many avenues that are being addressed. All this stuff is it's like launch codes. Like you think about it a million times. Like this is like ultra calculated, like to the nines. But everyone, all they do is they see the little snippet of the progress of the video, and they're like, "Oh, well, I would have done it like this, or I would have done it like that. You didn't think about this." It's like it's thought about, man. Just hold on.
Yeah, really. You're only seeing a tiny little window there.
Yeah.
But all that stuff's being taken care of. We're doing it in chunks, and it just takes time. There is nothing. There's an old saying in chiropractic. There is no. It's like healing technique number 6 or philosophy number 6. There is no process that doesn't take time. So it kind of gives you the idea of, hey man, it took you maybe 20 years to get that back pain. You're not just going to jump up over the weekend or 2 adjustments and you're out of there. Like all this stuff, it takes time. It's all thought out. Trust the process. So it's definitely an exciting journey. I'm really excited to hear these black swans. Apparently they're the bee's knees from what I hear from the guys at the Trinnov showroom in Connecticut.
Well, and Chuck, I think, would you agree that a good calibration takes time?
No question. And planning a theater and getting it right, same.
Yeah,
because you don't want to sit there and redo things like with more sophisticated calibration, processing, and whatnot. If you get it right, same thing with like your in camera. In photography, if you get it right in camera, your job is a lot easier in post production.
Exactly.
So I take that into consideration to heart for sure.
And if you're building a room, you want to get the dimensions right to begin with.
Yeah.
And that's a topic for a whole nother show.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Not everyone has the right room, right?
Exactly.
So sometimes you have to shoehorn
unfortunately.
And that very well may be something to address, well, certainly with acoustic treatments, but also with room correction. If you don't have the ideal dimensions of your room, length, width, height, I'm thinking of the obvious horrible situation of a cubicle room.
10 by 10 by 10.
Yeah. Man, that would just be horrible for bass, particularly.
10 by 20 by 10 would be even worse.
Yeah. Any kind of simple.
We don't want.
You don't want that if you can help it. That's for sure.
Yeah. There are some. Physics are physics. The rules of science are the rules of science. But again, like if you do the planning and you do the hard work, if you make sure that the extra efforts are done before you actually start, swinging the first hammer and putting in the first nail, it's going to make your job a lot easier. Not only as, you as the customer, but also as the person that's going to give that, turnkey system to you. And that is something that I like to take into consideration whenever I'm talking to customers as well.
Yeah,
right.
That's a big message. Planning is critical for properly creating a theater. And getting experts involved as early in the process as possible is highly recommended.
Yep, exactly right.
So I'll leave Scott's information down in the description. You guys can call him up and then he'll play in your room for you free of charge.
Well, no, I won't promise that, no. But I will continue to bring you valuable information on this show that you can then use and go and do your own research and find the best way to solve your particular problems, which are going to be unique to you. So stay tuned for much more great information like we had today. I want to thank Chuck Back, General Manager of Trinnov Audio, for sharing his wisdom with us today. Great bunch of information, Chuck. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And I hope you guys will all continue to watch and listen to our show, because we got a bunch of new and interesting stuff coming your way all through the end of the year and into next year. So keep an eye on this channel. And until next time, geek out.